Hi guys, welcome to the very first episode of Watch and Chill with me, Rob Cottingham. Now, we're going to be looking at some of my all-time favorite movies, and I want to start with a film I consider to be one of the best films of the 1980s, which is American Gigolo, which was written and directed by Paul Schrader. Now, Schrader had previously worked with Martin Scorsese on the acclaimed movie Taxi Driver, and American Gigolo does contain similarities with that previous movie. And the film was produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, and it's one of the first really big commercial movies that Paul Schrader worked on. And it paved the way for a lot of the 80s films, sex and violence, such as Jagged Edge, Fatal Attraction, and many, many more erotic thrillers. But we start with the opening intro to this film, which already sets us up for basically a classic of its kind. We are introduced to this extremely good-looking, handsome, fairly narcissistic, vain man whose name is Julian Kay, and he works as a high-class escort, mainly providing services to rich, older women who require company and often sex for their lonely evenings when they come to Beverly Hills. Now, Julian works for a high-class madam who basically is the procurer. She's the one who finds him his clients. But we get the sense that Julian Kay has worked himself up to this position. He previously worked more for a lower-class street hustler, and his pimp was played by Bill Duke in the film, who has a fairly scene-stealing role, fairly minor character, but certainly plays quite an important part in the movie as it progresses. Now let's just look at this opening scene for a while. Now, Julian Kay is a man who cares about outer qualities. The way he appears is highly important for his job. And it's no surprise that he's played by a fairly vain actor, Richard Gere, of course. Now, this was Richard Gere's really big breakout role, although he'd been in a couple of previous movies, most notably Days of Heaven, which was actually a very artistic movie. He went on to become one of the biggest commercial actors in Hollywood at the time. But American Gigolo, basically because of its fairly sexually explicit nature, the fact that it refers to prostitution, was actually not accepted by a lot of main Hollywood actors at the time. It was passed up by, amongst others, Christopher Reeve, who was Superman, of course, and then John Travolta, who'd just been in Saturday Night Fever, didn't want to have anything to do with the movie. Looking at the clothes he wears in this movie, you can see how well they fit the body of Richard Gere. And one of the things I love about this film is just how much it takes delight in the way Richard Gere dresses. And it's fairly unusual for a film to take such an investment in the way the characters appear. And in every scene, Richard Gere is sensual. There's no other word for it. The way he moves, the way he walks, the way he dresses. And the film actually really does almost objectify him in the same way that women have always been objectified in Hollywood. This movie particularly portrays Richard Gere in a very sexualized way, but it's one that is not necessarily exploitative, but is necessary considering the character. So Julian Kay is this high-class escort, and he has to use fairly euphemistic terms for what he does. He's often calling himself a chauffeur, an escort, but really he's paid to have sex with these lonely women. And most of the time, these encounters, they're fairly routine and they're not really shown to us in that much detail, because whilst on a date with somebody, Julian Kay by chance meets the wife of a very important Los Angeles congressman, and she's played by former model Lauren Hutton. Now that's an important factor as well to consider, because she's also an extremely stylish woman. And although Lauren Hutton's not known much as an actress these days, her part in this movie is not to be dismissed as just a model who thinks she can act. She's very appropriate for the role. Now, after Julian meets Michelle, she instantly takes a liking to him. And it's very interesting that she sees him in a different light to most of the other people Julian sleeps with, who see it just as a transaction. She is determined to get to know the real Julian, and she actually has to almost pursue him, find out where he lives, before he actually lets her into his life. Now, of course, it's complicated by the fact that A, she's married, and B, he's an escort who clearly doesn't want to get into any long-term, any serious relationships with his clients. And the film is extremely good at highlighting the difference between paid sex and sex in relationship, the loving kind of sex, as opposed to just the purely erotic sex. And the film has what's become really the key sex scene of the movie, which has its own instrumentation for the score, which is the seduction scene. Now, the seduction scene where she effectively seduces him as opposed to him seducing her. And it's a highly erotic, highly sensual scene in the movie. And the other thing to bear in mind is that most male actors would not, of course, want to bare their whole body in terms of full frontal nudity, but it's one that Richard Gere was happy to do for the movie, and it's gone down in history as being the first male nude scene in an American movie. Now, just when we think we know the kind of movie we're watching, we think we're just watching a kind of like expose of Hollywood sex and high-class gigolos, the film throws in the crime element. And it's when Julian has slept with a woman whose husband wanted to watch and wanted him to engage in sadomasochistic sex that Julian finds himself accused of the woman's eventual murder. Now, complicated for him is the fact that he doesn't have a clear, solid alibi. And he's eventually pursued by a sleazy detective who I think has one of the best scenes in the movie. And it's in this scene that Julian gives a clear justification for what he does and says that he doesn't consider there to be anything wrong with what he does, despite the fact that in most states in America, prostitution is, of course, illegal. Now, if you watch this scene, you get an instant idea of just the kind of man Julian is. He is above petty morality. He is above what most people would consider to be aspects of right or wrong. And it's what makes him such a fascinating character, because he seems so empty, yet he's got this depth below the surface. And it's the depth that his partner, his eventual partner, Michelle, is able to see and is able to really tap into. Now, we know that Paul Schrader in his life is a well-known Catholic, as is Martin Scorsese, and it's not hard to find elements of the Catholic belief in his movies. For example, in this movie, Julian Kay is clearly living in what many would consider to be a sinful lifestyle, and yet by the end of the movie, he's kind of stripped himself down. He's laid bare. And for a movie that takes delight in materialism so much, it's really interesting how toward the end of the movie, Julian effectively smashes up his apartment. He breaks everything down. He pulls down his stereo. He pulls down a lot of his expensive artworks. And by the end of the film, he's not wearing designer clothes anymore. He's wearing basically prison overalls. Now, that's very symbolic because his penitence, as it were, is the fact that he's given up his rich, expensive lifestyle. He no longer sleeps for money. And then he's finally able to actually understand what love is. He's never been able to realize the difference between love and being paid to have sex. And the character of Michelle is so important here because she is almost his redeeming figure. She is his savior. And if you look at the way Michelle is shown in the movie, she's always brightly lit. She's portrayed in a kind of golden sunshine halo effect. And that's unlike most of the other characters of Julian's world, particularly the nighttime LA characters, the hustlers and the pimps, and particularly the characters in the gay bar toward the end of the movie. She is the complete opposite. And the way she's dressed as well is in very floaty, very light beige colors with her blonde hair coming down. There's no accident here. This is Schrader's way of signposting the fact that she is going to be Julian's redemption from his sinful world. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the last scene of the movie as well, because this was actually heavily criticized by critics at the time who very much misunderstood what Schrader wanted to achieve in the film's closing scene. Now, if you're familiar with a French New Wave film known as Pickpocket, you'll understand that there's a lot of similarities between the subject matter of that movie and this movie. And Schrader borrows from the final scene where the pickpocket's in prison being visited by his girlfriend by showing Julian Kay behind the prison glass actually wanting to reach out and touch Michelle, but can't because of the glass between them, and yet they can see each other. And that, in a sense, is enough. She can see him naked like never before. He is opening himself up to her finally. And the last line is very important. The last line of the movie, of course, is when Julian says to her, "It's taken me so long to come to you." Now, really, he could have seen it as earlier on that she clearly loved him, but he wasn't ready to engage in that kind of relationship with her. He wasn't ready for that acceptance. But the movie makes it clear that Julian has finally reached a point where he is able to love somebody. And for me, that scene is still very powerful. I've watched it many times. It's very well directed. The lighting in the scene is incredible. The composition, the way the characters are composed. For me, that movie's final scene is very, very good. Now, if we look at the long-term effects of this movie, it can be seen in terms of its highlighting of consumerism that was going to become the key part of the 80s for many people, was the fact that it was all about amassing wealth, luxury, designer goods, status, fashion brands. And we can see that in the rise of Donald Trump. We can see that in books such as American Psycho, Bonfire of the Vanities. And even if you watch this movie now, you don't get the sense of watching a dated movie. This film feels amazingly current for today's kind of narcissistic, Instagram-led social media culture. And it's very interesting that this movie has just been turned into a Showtime season, a TV show, which looks at Julian Kay finally looking for the person who actually committed the Ryman murder. It's set in the current day, so Julian's a lot older. And in the TV series, Julian is looking for Michelle. And I've not seen the TV series. I know it's being produced by Bruckheimer, and it's got the cooperation of Paul Schrader. So I'll be very interested to see how that goes. But for me, American Gigolo is again one of the best films of the 80s. It's a great film if you like Richard Gere, of course. And if you're interested in fashion, you've got to see the way Julian carries off some of these amazing designs by Giorgio Armani. And one more word, the score is one of Giorgio Moroder's finest electronic scores. He did movies like American Express, Flashdance, Cat People. He was all over the 80s in terms of soundtracks. But the theme tune, again, played by Blondie, is an incredible piece of work. It was one of the songs of the year. And I can't think of a better song to be used in such a hedonistic, sexual film as this than the song Call Me by Blondie. So for me, this has always been one of my favorite films, and it's a pleasure to introduce it and great to start my movie channel with one of my favorite movies. So thanks for listening, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.